Hello, everyone. My name is David Horn, and I'm the founder of Funding Focus. I'm delighted to be with you here today at the Women's Business Club conference. So what I'm going to do is take you through a journey that I've been on over the last 3 years, a journey that, quite frankly, has changed my life. And it's a journey that I call the fight for fairer funding. I'm going to start with some pretty bad news, some stark moves. I'm then going to move on to some better news. And then I'm going to delve deeper into why this whole issue about unfair funding to female founders exists in the world today. And then I'm going to take you through what we can do to address that, what work I've been doing and how you can learn from that to successfully raise funding to grow your business. So all of this started about 3.5 years ago when I was speaking at an event and about fundraising for SME businesses. And after my talk, a woman came up to me and asked me a very simple question. Why is it that so little funding goes to female founders? I looked at her and I said, I have no idea, but I'll find out. And as I said, that question has changed my life. So I started digging deeper into this, and I met with certain people and I started reading the research, and eventually I decided that someone had to do something about it, because whilst the investment industry was making a few noises, and only noises, but not really anything else, nobody was looking at this from the perspective of the entrepreneurs. And so I ran an event at the London Stock Exchange in November of 2019. And one of the key things that I presented to that was the findings from a report that had been published by the British Business Bank that showed just how bad the situation is for female founders. So let me just share that with you now. So this is based on data that was researched by the British Business Bank, published in 2019. They looked at every venture capital deal in the UK in 2017. And they found that out of every pound invested, less than a penny went to all female teams. Mixed gender teams got 10p, and all male teams got 89p. Now that's shocking of its own, but when you delve further into the data, you'll see an even greater issue, and one which totally contradicts the statement made by many people in the venture capital industry that they're just not seeing deal flow from female founders. So in those all-female teams, out of all of the investments decks submitted, all female teams submitted 5% of the decks, and they got less than 1% of the funding. So that's a 1 in 5 ratio. Mixed gender teams submitted 20% of the decks and got 10% of the money. So that's a 1 in 2 ratio. And all male teams submitted 75% of the decks and got 89% of the money. That's 1.2 to 1. That is clearly not fair. Now, this data is now 5 years old. So what's the situation today? Well, I'm sorry to say that it really hasn't changed much, despite all the noise that's been made in the market. So this report here looks at the share of funding to female founders, mixed gender founders, and all male founders based on all of Europe, including the UK, in 2020 and in 2021. Now, in 2020, the situation had improved slightly, where all female teams were getting 2.4% of the funding. And yet last year, in 2021, the year that broke all records for the amount of funding that went into the venture capital sector and got invested, in Europe alone, it was more than $100 billion. Never before had that level of funding been seen before. And yet all female teams, their share of funding collapsed back to 1%. So it's unchanged from what we saw at the British Business Bank report in 2017. All female teams submitted 5% of the pitch decks and got 1% of the funding. The situation for mixed gender teams has changed a little bit. Their share of the decks has slipped a little, but their share of the money received has grown a little bit. So there is some movement of some sign of positive movement for mixed gender teams. And then all male teams are still getting a disproportionate share. So 83% in 2020, 85% in 2021 of the funding went to all male teams. And what's it like this year? Well, this 2022 has been a very interesting year. You know, the level of funding that's gone into venture capital has fallen back quite sharply. compared to where it was in 2021 for obvious reasons with the Ukraine war and the global economic situation, but it is still carrying on. But in Europe, we're seeing all female funding teams submitted, and this is data through August of 2022, submitted 5.2% of the pitch decks and got 1% of the funding. Mixed gender team, 17.4% of the decks and 12.1% of the funding. So even the mixed gender teams are sliding back a little bit. And the all male teams in Europe submitted 77% of the decks and got 87% of the funding. So the funding to the share of funding going to male founding teams is still on the rise. That's the situation in Europe. Let's just slide across the Atlantic and see what happened in the United States. So again, we're looking at 2020 and 2021. So all female founding teams in 2020 submitted 6.4% of the decks and got 2.2% of the funding. In 2021, it was 6.5% of the decks and they got 2% of the funding. Now, this is really interesting because that means that the statistics in the United States for the share of funding to female founders has actually fallen for 3 years in a row now. Fallen. Mixed gender teams, 12.3% in 2020, 15.6% in 2021. So seeing some growth there, but still the men are getting more than 80% of the funding. And again, if we look at the data in 2022 for the USA, all female teams submitted 6.8% of the decks, so up a little bit, but their share of the funding is still flat on 2%. Mixed gender teams submitted 18.6% of the decks, so pretty much the same level, and they got 14.8%. So it's falling back a little bit again. And the all male team submitted 17.75% of the decks and got 83% of the funding. So there's clearly an issue here. And as I say, so many of the investors that I speak to say, oh, we've got a problem with deal flow, or oh, we're not seeing the kinds of deals, or oh, there's not enough female founders. Rubbish. They're either deluded or they're lying, because there is plenty of evidence to show that all female and mixed gender teams are still continuing to submit significant quantities of pitch decks, and they are not being funded at the same level as all male teams.